In the middle of the 19th century, Ireland was a country of great poverty. Most of the land was owned by a small number of wealthy landlords, many of whom lived in Britain. The majority of the Irish population were tenant farmers. They rented small plots of land to live on and grow their food. For these families, survival depended almost entirely on one single crop, the potato. The potato was an ideal food source for the poor. It was nutritious and could grow in large quantities even on very small patches of poor quality soil. An Irish farmer could feed his entire family for a year on just 1 or 2 acres of potatoes. This reliance, however, created a very dangerous situation for the country. The economic system in Ireland was deeply flawed and placed immense pressure on the poorest people. These tenant farmers had to pay high rents to their landlords. To pay the rent, they would grow cash crops like wheat, oats, and barley. These valuable grains were not for them to eat. They were sold and often exported to Britain to generate money for the rent payments. The potatoes they grew were what they and their families lived on day after day. This meant that while the fields of Ireland were producing plenty of food, the people who worked the land had access to only the most basic sustenance. Their lives were balanced on a knife's edge, completely dependent on the success of each year's potato harvest. Before the 1840s, the potato had been a reliable staple for generations. It allowed the Irish population to grow rapidly, reaching over 8 million people by 1845. Families were often large, and the small plots of land were divided and subdivided to provide for sons as they grew up and started their own families. This system, known as subdivision, meant that holdings became smaller and smaller over time. It became impossible to grow anything other than potatoes to feed a family on such tiny plots. This over-reliance was a disaster waiting to happen. The entire social and economic structure of rural Ireland was built upon a single, vulnerable foundation. This precarious situation set the stage for one of the greatest tragedies in European history. The people were poor, with no savings or alternative food sources to fall back on. The political and economic power was held by a class of landowners who were disconnected from the struggles of their tenants. The government in London had little understanding of the unique conditions in Ireland and the extreme poverty that defined the lives of millions. When the potato crop failed, it was not just a harvest that was lost. It was the entire food supply for the majority of the nation. The system that had sustained a growing population for so long was about to collapse with catastrophic consequences. The cause of the Great Famine was a microscopic fungus called Phytophthora infestans, commonly known as potato blight. This airborne fungus traveled to Europe from North America, arriving in Ireland in the late summer of 1845. The weather that year was unusually cool and moist, creating the perfect conditions for the blight to spread rapidly. Farmers first noticed the leaves of their potato plants turning black and curling up as if they had been scorched by fire. When they dug up the potatoes, they found that the tubers had turned into a foul-smelling, inedible black mush. The blight spread with terrifying speed across the entire country, destroying about half of the potato crop in its first year. The initial failure of the crop in 1845 caused serious hardship, but people hoped it was a one-time event. They believed the next year's harvest would be better. However, the blight returned in 1846 with even greater force. This time, it destroyed almost the entire potato crop. This was the moment the hardship turned into a full-blown famine. Families who had managed to survive the first year by selling their few possessions or getting small loans now had absolutely nothing left. Their only source of food was gone. The fields that were once green and promised life now brought only decay and despair. The smell of rotting potatoes hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the disaster. The response from the British government was tragically inadequate. They believed in a policy of laissez-faire, which meant that the government should not interfere with the economy. They were reluctant to provide free food, fearing it would make the people dependent and disrupt trade. Food exports from Ireland to Britain continued even as the Irish people starved. While the potato crop failed, other crops like wheat and oats were still being grown and harvested. Seeing these carts of food being transported to the ports for export while their own children were hungry was a source of immense anger and bitterness for the Irish people. The relief efforts that were put in place, like public works projects, were poorly managed and often failed to help those who needed it most. The situation grew worse with each passing year. The blight returned again in 1847, a year that became known as Black 47 due to the extreme suffering. Disease began to spread rapidly among the weakened population. Typhus, dysentery, and cholera, which became known as famine fevers, swept through the workhouses and villages, killing more people than starvation itself. Doctors and relief workers were overwhelmed. The social fabric of the country began to unravel completely. The scale of death and disease was unlike anything Ireland had ever experienced. The nation was in the grip of a catastrophe that seemed to have no end. Daily life during the famine was a desperate struggle for survival. With no potatoes to eat, families resorted to extreme measures. They ate whatever they could find: wild berries, nettles, seaweed, and even grass. Some families were forced to sell every last possession they owned: their furniture, their tools, the very clothes off their backs, just to buy a small amount of food. When the money ran out, there was nothing left. The bonds of community, once strong in rural Ireland, began to break down under the immense strain. People became too weak and too focused on their own family's survival to help their neighbors. The familiar sounds of music and laughter in the villages were replaced by an eerie and profound silence. The government's main form of relief was the workhouse. These were grim, prison-like institutions where the poorest people could go for food and shelter. To enter the workhouse, a family had to give up any land they had, no matter how small. Conditions inside were deliberately harsh to discourage people from seeking help. Families were split up upon entry. Men, women, and children were all sent to separate quarters. They were subjected to hard labor and strict rules in exchange for meager rations of food. Overcrowding was severe, and disease spread like wildfire. For many, entering the workhouse was a death sentence, yet millions were left with no other choice. Another form of relief was the public works projects. The government hired starving people to build roads and walls, often in remote areas and for very low wages. The work was physically demanding, and the men were already weak from hunger. Many collapsed and died at the work sites. The wages they earned were often not enough to feed their families, and the projects did little to solve the core problem: the lack of available food. These roads to nowhere that were built during the famine still exist in parts of the Irish countryside today, serving as haunting physical reminders of the flawed relief policies and the immense human suffering they caused. For those who remained in their homes, eviction was a constant threat. Landlords wanted to clear their land of poor tenants who could no longer pay rent. They hired men to carry out evictions, often with brutal force. Families were thrown out of their small cottages, and their homes were frequently torn down or burned to prevent them from returning. These evicted families were left to wander the roads with no food and no shelter, exposed to the elements. Many built crude shelters called scalps by digging holes in the ground and covering them with turf. These desperate measures rarely saved them from the cold, hunger, and disease that claimed so many lives. As the famine wore on, it became clear to many that their only hope for survival was to leave Ireland forever. This marked the beginning of a massive wave of emigration. People sold whatever they could to afford the price of a ticket on a ship bound for North America or Britain. The journey across the Atlantic was perilous. The ships were often overcrowded, poorly maintained, and lacked adequate food, water, and sanitation. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped and filthy conditions below deck. These vessels came to be known as coffin ships because so many passengers died during the voyage from disease or starvation. For those who undertook the journey, it was a desperate gamble for a new life. The impact of this mass migration on Ireland was profound and permanent. Between 1845 and 1855, over 2 million people either died or emigrated. The country's population was decimated, falling by nearly 25%. The demographic landscape of Ireland was changed forever. The areas that suffered the most were in the west of Ireland, where the Irish language was most commonly spoken. The famine dealt a devastating blow to the language and the traditional Gaelic culture of these regions. The social structure was also altered, as the class of small tenant farmers was virtually wiped out. The fields fell silent, and entire villages disappeared from the map, leaving behind only ruins and memories. Those who survived the journey and arrived in places like the United States, Canada, and Britain faced new challenges. They were often poor, sick, and uneducated, and they encountered prejudice and discrimination. They crowded into urban slums and took on the most difficult and low-paying jobs. However, over time, these Irish immigrants and their descendants established strong and vibrant communities. They built churches, schools, and social organizations, and they played a significant role in shaping the societies where they settled. the Irish diaspora became a powerful global network, maintaining strong ties to their homeland and influencing its political future from afar. The Great Famine is a defining event in Irish history, and its legacy is still felt today. It created a deep and lasting sense of grievance against the British government for its inadequate response to the crisis. This fueled the movement for Irish independence in the decades that followed. Remembering the famine is crucial. It serves as a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences of poverty, social inequality, and political indifference. It honors the memory of the millions who suffered and died, and it stands as a solemn lesson on the vulnerability of human societies and the importance of compassion and justice in times of crisis. The story of the famine is not just Irish history. It is a universal human story of survival, loss, and resilience.